Well, every Monday we invite a leading analyst, a commentator or journalist to talk to us about the major political stories dominating the news cycles. As you know, there are a number of inquiries investigating major governance system failures during the administration of former President Jacob Zuma, from SARS, once a world-class revenue collection agency, to attacks on national treasury and, of course, dodgy contracts at state-owned enterprises. Such was the pervasiveness of state capture. Well, we're joined now by investigative journalist Sabelo Skiti, who comes in, and good evening to you, and thank you so much for doing our Political View conversation.
Evening, Bongan, and evening to the viewers.
Right, I suppose we're going to try and break it down in terms of themes. Let's start with what we've heard that's emerged from the state capture inquiry, looking at the role of Des van Rooyen at Treasury. I mean, I'm reminded of that biblical passage that says, "Now we know in part, we shall know fully at the judgment." That's exactly the sense that we're beginning to get, because obviously investigative journalists are part of how we got here in the first place in terms of what we knew. But did you suspect it was as bad as what we're now hearing?
I think once you're beginning to get the full picture, it's even scary. It's even worse than what you would have imagined. I mean, we all knew the tensions that existed, for instance, at GCIS, but what we heard last week and today from Pumla Williams was quite shocking. And I think as we begin to also unpack that role that was played by former Minister Van Rooyen, who was there, remember, for only just a day, you know.
Right.
It was 4 days in all, but at actual National Treasury, it was a couple of hours on a Friday.
Just take us back to, obviously, after the announcement had been made, take us back to the advisors, because that was one of the central issues that was under discussion at the time. He was being asked, who are these people? What are they here to do? What's emerged now?
So, in terms of what's emerged now, we still don't have that picture up until we have National Treasury actually come in. We suspect that that individual is going to be the former Director General Lungisa Fuzile, who of course was the first Treasury official to meet former Minister Van Rooyen on the Thursday afternoon at the swearing in.
Wasn't it fact that he threatened to resign at the time because he didn't know who these people were and what they were doing there? Wasn't that one of the things that was reported?
Well, I think, you know, looking at Lungisa himself, he was quite shocked, you know, having spoken to a lot of people around him, at that sort of, at the swiftness with which everything happened. Remember, the swearing in was on Thursday. The Friday, the minister comes. Normally, it's just, you know, a first meeting with the DGs, just get a lay of the land, see what's in the inbox, see what are the immediate sort of appointments that you have. They arm you, they give you a couple of technical pointers. But no one really ever goes there on that day with advisors, you know, and like a full team in tow. So for those people who had already known that there was a plan to sort of take over the Treasury, this was seen as an aggressive move towards achieving that.
I mean, we just showed a picture of your front page from last week. What did Des do? I mean, there it is. It really does seem that he didn't have a moment to waste.
No, not at all. We, of course, know that one of the things that happened almost immediately was that Minister Van Rooyen was ransacking, you know, the inbox. And one of the documents that were there was a presentation that was going to Cabinet the following week. From what we've been able to trace and, you know, email movements and all of that, that email was then sent to one of the advisors, Mohammed Popat, who had been an employee at Regiment's Capital. He then, of course, shared it with Gupta ally Eric Wood. What we know from the conversations that took place when Wood sent it to Salim Essa is that they wanted to sort of see what sort of high-level information was there that would allow them to get a foot into National Treasury. Remember, in terms of procurement at the time, the guys had gotten a foot into Transnet, a foot into Eskom, and National Treasury, because of its role, was one of those areas that was reviewing a lot of these contracts that they were getting. But besides that, there was also, if you're able to come in as an advisor at National Treasury, it means that you have a lot of ambit and room to play with all the procurement that the state does, because that's where everything is centralized to.
I think one of the things that's now also emerging, that of course Des van Rooyen is not the only minister that's accused of having given documents, cabinet documents, to Gupta allies or associates.
Of course, I mean, Minister Faith Mutambi is one of those ministers as well. Her role was put out quite clearly early on in the days of, those leaked Gupta emails. She was one of the first people to actually take out a cabinet memo and send it to, the Gupta family before this memo was actually published. And in it was contained a lot of information related to the SABC and various, communications policy, which then allowed the Gupta family, who had interests in broadcast media, an advantage to know what policy direction was going to be taken.
I mean, some of it, looking back, seems to have been so brazen. You remember, of course, the former president Jacob Zuma telling us that Des van Rooyen was, in fact, the most qualified finance minister we'd ever had.
Well, I mean, it was always funny to us, because if you then got a look at some of the emails that were doing the rounds, I think through the Gupta emails and through the various court actions where some of these things were placed as part of the record, you could see that even at Kokta, Minister van Rooyen didn't seem to have a full grasp of things, and he relied on a lot of these Gupta allies to actually give him advice on how to proceed in terms of government policy and, what was being discussed in those various departments.
We can't forget Ben Turek saying that, in fact, he'd spent most of his time as a backbencher, worried about his studies rather than parliamentary processes. All right, let's talk now about SARS, because that's also been another matter that's been unfolding. We've been seeing some of the evidence that's been emerging there, and this issue of these consultants, Bain in particular, they'd come in highly recommended in a sense. And what we heard from Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene saying that he thought Tom Moyane was acting in good faith, because of course we know he'd come in when his predecessor had left under a cloud.
Yes. It certainly did look like that, but if you look at the intricacies and the detail that has been revealed by those officials who were there at SARS, the fact that even research and doing just a nice proper take on the organization was not done properly. They didn't interview key people, and what I liked about the appearance of National Treasury last week at the Commission was the fact that they unpacked just how the process that was followed to appoint Bain was so flawed. And of course, the lead partner from Bain confirming that he had spoken to Tom Moyane months before he'd even been appointed at SARS. So it sort of shows you just how some of these things were being laid layer by layer, preparing to make sure that when these people come in, the looting can just be accelerated.
And of course, I mean, they've done some good work at the Development Bank, so you can understand in a sense how maybe harder questions ought to have been asked at the time, but weren't.
Yes, I think we will probably start looking back at those deals now. I know, for instance, they did good work at Telkom as well. But when you actually scrutinize again the process that was followed at Telkom, procurement processes were flouted. They came in initially on a 91 million rand contract, only to look at Telkom's introduction of cellulars as well as the fiber optic options, and then it accelerates to also they do a whole organizational restructure.
One of the things, of course, that has been central to discussions now is how much power the Commissioner has, because even though the impression has been that Treasury was approached in some of these decisions, we heard from Minister Nene that because it's really an operational matter, it was really actually always up to SARS to decide itself what they wanted to do with these.
Yes, of course, and I think one of the key discussions, as you say, was around the power of the Commissioner, and you heard Judge Dennis Davis introduce the possibility of saying maybe there ought to be a board overlooking and playing that oversight role between National Treasury as the shareholder and the Commissioner, to make sure that you curb some of those powers.
Minister Nene seems to agree with that.
Yes. I mean, it is a good idea, of course, but one also then, would look at the state of our SOEs, all of which have boards playing oversight in any case.
Sorry to come in there. I thought what was particularly interesting is that Bain insists that what they did at SARS was good work. They've got nothing to apologize for.
Well, I mean, at some stage, if we go back in the recent past, Bongani, KPMG insisted that everything they did for SARS was above board. I think the statement that Bain put out yesterday was pretty telling, in that they were now saying that they are going to look into that entire project that they did there at Bain, at SARS, pardon me, and they are going to look at the processes that were followed just to make sure that everything that they did do was indeed above board.
So this is yet another example of one of the big guns coming in. Everything ostensibly looks above board, but actually when you drill down to the details, it's again a picture of the complicity that was required for all of these projects to unfold.
Yes, and I mean, for me, it again highlights the importance, or rather the role that is played by these consultancies. I think if you look at, the last 2 financial years, you're looking at close to 60 billion rand that has been expended of the public purse on consultancy fees, and a lot of that stuff, if you look at how these government departments, SOEs are functioning, you begin to ask whether that was good value for money or not.
So let's talk about the other story that's emerged from the weekend, and that's of course around Vincent Smith. I mean, he's just one of those people that has a reputation, certainly from the work he's been doing on the land reform process. Yes. There's this idea that he's one of the good guys.
It was a shock to see that sort of article coming out about, an MP of his caliber. You think that also it comes at a time when he'd just been appointed to head up a new portfolio committee. And then you see these sort of relations and these monies that have been trading hands.
Well, let's talk about what the story actually says. It's alleged that he received, 670,000 rands. There was work done on his house, for example. That amounts to, over 200,000 rand. It hasn't denied necessarily everything, says nothing untoward. Some of those monies were personal loans, he says.
But I think the key thing here, Bongani, again, is what has he admitted to? He's admitted that some of the monies he did get, he's not given us an amount of how much that money actually was, and it's not clear right now whether these were declared in the members' register or not. And it's important in this instance that they be declared, because this is an entity that did a lot of work with government departments that at some stage Vincent Smith was a portfolio committee member doing oversight on. So it was important to sort of have that relationship laid out, and so that people know that this person, there might be a possible conflict. Now, when you're investigating stories, when that is not there, it's normally a very big red flag.
I mean, Zolinze Mavavi, in a naughty way, tweeted yesterday, the SAF to lead, saying, quoting former DA leader Tony Leon, saying it's becoming quite clear that telling an ANC member to resist corruption is rather like telling a crocodile to resist meat.
Look, it's the ANC, I think, is under the cosh at the moment. From reading, the public posture, they assume that after the Jacob Zuma era,
they'd be given a clean slate.
Yes, but more and more things are coming out.
Well, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about their reaction. We'll talk about Faith Mutambi, of course, remains a member of parliament, given what we heard today. Some of those advisors had connections within the governing party. That and more in terms of the fallout that's emerging from all of these inquiries. Stay with us. We've got more with our investigative journalist guest at the Mail and Guardian, Sabelo Skiti. You are watching The Political View.